yeah, we have a live audience, so hello everybody in the gallery space, and then we also have people tuning in from all over our team. Um, really excited that you guys are here. We have Shazia as a moderator. Charley, Sylvan, and Jerome are going to be talking about boat as matrix, and particularly wooden boat. So that's like super exciting. I'm Drew. I'm going to be here to help Charley with the chat, really. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, so welcome everybody to the Voters Matrix panel. We'll begin with the land acknowledgement, and then we'll get into it with Jerome, Sylvan, and Charley directly. So before anything else, let's get started on that. St. Michael's Print Shop recognizes that it resides and conducts activities on Nukdanguk and interacts within the unceded territories and land of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. St. Michael's commits to uplift the voices and follow the lead of Indigenous communities working towards decolonization and to do important anti-racist work in the shop and in our community. St. Michael's Print Shop commits to confront settler colonialism in an effort to decolonize its space and structure while prioritizing the safety of Indigenous people and artists. So with that said, we'll go ahead. I will introduce our panelists. I will begin with Jerome Canning, master boat builder, who is joining us today. Jerome first began boat building in Placentia Bay, Newfoundland and Labrador, where he spent his summers fishing with his father and brothers and building boats during the winter. Those early boats were used as part of his family's fishing enterprise or sold to commercial fisher persons. In 1983, Jerome received a diploma in small craft design from the Department of Naval Architecture at the Marine Institute in St. John's. Since then, Jerome has continued to build wooden boats, some of which have been featured in Newfoundland and Labrador cultural heritage celebrations. So I'll turn it over to you to begin, Jerome. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I think you said everything I was about to say. So very good. Look, first of all, thank you to all of you guys for inviting me. It's a pleasure. In particular, after seeing what Charley sent today to our Wooden Boat Museum, it is such gorgeous work. I was so moved by all of them, but in particular one that was superimposed over the other. And really that, I have to tell you, Charley, you don't understand maybe that I was moved by it, because for the past number of years, that particular image is really deep inside me. The recognition of our punts, and that recognition of our punts is really the recognition of all of our ancestors and what they contribute to the development of boats in our coastal waters. And anyway, my dear, it was gorgeous. Thank you. And if you did send me another one, Betty claimed it, I'd be very happy. Anyway, I was born on an island in Placentia Bay, which is the very opposite of this bay here. This is Trinity Bay to the north, and to the south of us is another bay, one that sort of most baymen in our bay refer to as a far greater bay. It's a Ray Guy saying. Ray Guy was a Placentia Bayman. And in all his writings, he always talked about the far greater bay of Placentia Bay. But anyway, I'm from that bay. As many years ago, the island I was born on is an island called Mershin Island. Seawolf, that's what it means. It's a resettled community. It all got emptied in '67. My family had moved in a little bit earlier, and like most people in Outport, Newfoundland, my father went elsewhere for work, but not that far away. Actually across the bay. And so all of us landed in the town of Placentia in a boat, climbed up over the wharf. I was carried in my older brother's arms, and we began our life in Placentia. But the thing about growing up in Placentia, one place never left us is the island of Mershin. Mershin has been my heart and soul all my life. In early '70s, my father took early retirement from, he was a mariner, and he took early retirement, and he wanted to go back fishing. And so I was a teacher at that time. I was teaching elementary school in another bay, St. Mary's Bay. I had a brother who was a hydrographer working on a ship mapping charting oceans, and another brother who was studying religious studies. The three of us just dropped our books and our careers, and we went with our dad in a boat that he got from another brother, one of my oldest brothers. And with that, we all went fishing, but it turned out the boat was a little too on the small side. And I was the youngest of those two brothers I just mentioned, Adrian and Cletus. My dad's name, by the way, is Martin. And so it fell to me, if I'm going to get in a boat, I'm going to have to build one. And that's what I did. And fortunate for me, I ended up in a town where all of the older builders were still alive and still fishing in Placentia Bay. They were resettled people. They had been moved through many circumstances, but essentially the home communities of Placentia Bay, a good many of them moved to Placentia. Anyway, their lives weren't that changed from the times they were in the old communities. They still built boats and they still fished in the communities that they were raised and reared in. So I went to their sheds really and outdoors, and I learned as much as I could about building boats before we began our own. And that to me is one of the most beautiful memories I have of these older guys, all of whom, by the way, are now passed on. And there's some I wrote about and think about on a daily basis, how they gave so freely and helped me learn to love what I do now. And that's drawing, living, breathing, talking to you guys about boats, but in particular our Newfoundland boats. That fishing experience, actually, the reason we all dropped what we were doing and went fishing was our father. We is my dad. And he mentored, raised us, and now we fished alongside of him. It was just so beautiful. In our boats that we built, the home, a little shed on the island, we built stages and stages that we built together, the fish that we caught together, the disappointments, oh man, it was best years of my life, I can honestly say. And sometimes I go on and on about it, and I tend to go on about it right here, just to tell you that if you ever have a chance to work with someone who you dearly love and they can show you lots of things, jump at it, because it's we all move on. And those people, my dad is gone now, and so is my mom, but I'll never forget those years. I remember one time coming in out of Placentia Bay. My brothers were married. I was a single guy. I was going to the bars when we got in, chasing the girls, young man. But I never forget my two brothers' wives and my mother standing on the beach in a place called Point Verde, looking out to the ocean, waiting for our boat to come in. It's an image I'll never forget. Those three beautiful women. And they had massive influence on us men, and hairy arse men that we were. My beard is gray right now, but then it was black, and my hair was black. It was longer. We're talking 70s. I wasn't a hippie, but I have to tell you, I was a renewed Newfoundlander from that ocean experience and fishing. I built lots of boats, but not as many of these men who I learned from. They built boats. This past few years, one of the things I'm learning now is who these men were. I mean, it's not just Placentia Bay men, but fortunately for me, being here in Winterton, because that's where I work. I work here at the boat shop in Winterton, the Wooden Boat Museum boat shop. I teach mostly. I teach everyone from everywhere about Newfoundland punts and our own dories and this kind of stuff. It's a delightful job. It's the best any person can ask for, to build a boat and to show others to do it, because that's how I learned, the caring of others and their desire to pass on what they knew. Actually, the number of students that I have in contact with, participants we call them, have so far outpaced and passed the number of boats I built. So one thing I can say with hopefully some humble pride is that I touch more people. I don't know how I touch them, but I touch more people than with them learning how to build boats than the boats I actually built. And so that's about the best I could say. And in particular, when Shazia and Charley, when you guys came there last year. Well, these are experiences that are just so precious. You know, to be introduced to your crafts, careers, your persons, really, because we're not anybody. Our art is only us, what's inside. We turn ourselves inside out, you know, when we do our art. So we see you on the surface, and then we see your work, and Charley, it was gorgeous. Thank you. Thank you very much. Am I going on too long, too much? Do I got my 10 minutes up? I got tons of life in between those years in the beginning of Ascension Bay and right now, no more than the rest of you, I'm sure. But it's a good life, and the best thing about it is trying to encourage, not necessarily for people to become boat builders. That's difficult to become a wooden boat builder. I'm the only employed boat builder in Newfoundland. Okay, big industry. So if I employ one person who becomes a good boat builder, they will replace me. But anyway, I would. People are interested in boats mostly from a heritage and history perspective, but the actual doing of that takes so many years. I'm afraid to tell you. I'm sure each one of you in your crafts know the millions of mistakes you have to make and the millions and millions of things you have to learn from those mistakes, and how it reveals yourself, those mistakes and those experiences, before you become even half ourselves. And that's where I am now in my life. I'm still a boat builder, and hopefully remain for a few more years. Anyway, that's it.
Well, thank you so much, Jerome. That was beautiful. Thank you very much. We'll move on to Sylvan now. Sylvan Hamburger is a visual artist working in printmaking, installation, and public art. His practice often engages community collaboration, discarded objects, and demolished architecture to explore notions of belonging, memory, and placemaking amidst changing landscapes and cultures. So I'll turn it over to Sylvan.
Thanks, Shazia. Wow, to follow Jerome. We haven't met in person, but it's a real pleasure to be on this panel with you and Charley and Shazia. During my time in Terra Nova, your name came up quite a few times, Jerome, as maybe the only employed boat builder in the country, in the province. I'm zooming in from the West Coast, from Vancouver at the moment, on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And yeah, like Shazia mentioned, I've got a little PowerPoint that with some images of what I was up to during my visit. But last fall, I had the opportunity to spend a month in Terra Nova National Park. And do a project that engaged with an old punt boat on the Eastport Peninsula, and it was kind of a follow-up to a residency I'd done a year earlier at St. Michael's Print Shop, where I wanted to do that. I wanted to do the project that I ended up doing in Terra Nova, but it didn't end up coming to fruition at that time. And my interest in these kind of old boats kind of is two-part. One, my family ended up on the West Coast a couple generations back, where my father was kind of attracted to the West Coast because my grandmother fell in love with a salmon fisherman, and lived on his boat for quite a few years before he passed away. So there's kind of that draw, and then there's just an interest in kind of relics and the things that are still kind of around that maybe allude to ways in which we once lived, maybe ways in which we still live, but especially within these like times that are changing a lot, where the architecture of spaces is changing a lot, the technology that we use is changing a lot. Questions of like how we find belonging or a sense of home within those changing tides. So maybe I'll share my PowerPoint real quick. Here we are. Okay. So in October, last October, I arrived in a little cabin in Terra Nova National Park. The park was pretty much empty at the time. Tourist season was over, and started working with a man named David Saunders, who works for the park, lives in Glovertown, is a real enthusiast of old wooden boats. He's attempted to make a couple himself, and was just very excited that someone was coming in, was interested. And part of what brought me in was this, like I had mentioned, this interest in kind of changing culture, and how people situate themselves within that. And I'd mainly been doing that in a more urban context of built environments changing in cities and things like that, particularly my community of East Vancouver, which is gentrifying very, very quickly. And then what was interesting was to end up in a rural community and find that there were similar pressures taking place, and similar kind of like people really upholding these old traditions, but then that kind of sense of everything kind of being the same or generalized, or almost like placelessness, that seems to kind of characterize North American culture, was definitely also present in rural communities as well. So through David, I got connected with the Squire Penny family, which is a family that's lived on the Eastport Peninsula, which is on the east coast of Newfoundland, for many, many generations. And they still had the old punt built by their, well, depending on who you ask, anywhere from their great-grandfather to their great-great-great-grandfather. And he was a farmer, and he built this boat and was using it had used it to collect capelin fish, to fertilize his fields. So being a printmaker, and largely someone who works in relief printing, I decided to try to take some impressions of the boat, which involved inking up the sides, putting large sheets of fabric down, and applying pressure by hand to get the impression. So this is me doing some initial tests on the farm, where it was built and the family still lives. Then we decided to take it down to the local school, where the great-granddaughter of Alfred Squire teaches, and the great-great-grandson goes to school. And that was a really kind of exciting day. I'm very interested in how kind of treating the making of the print as very much part of it, maybe even more the work of art than the outcome. And so we inked it up. There's the school. And then throughout the course of the day, the entire school came out, ranging from kindergartners to people that were about to graduate. So in this photo, there is, I believe the great-grandson is in the middle with the red cap on. There we are rubbing the sides. Some of the kids. There's David Saunders. So then there were people like David Saunders and other boat builders in the area who came down to kind of talk to the kids as we were going. And it was just like, it was a very, very meaningful day, and very moving to hear stories of these kids. A lot of them like had remembered their grandfathers tinkering around with boat building in their sheds, or there were a lot of stories about how this tradition was actually still alive and well. Then I took the boat back to the farm, continued to take different sorts of impressions off of it, with the idea of then having a series of prints that could circulate around the east coast of Newfoundland, as a series of kind of installations that would kind of exist as almost like living pictures. So they would react to the weather, to the place, to the architecture that it was hanging off of. and hopefully in places that were kind of significant to boat building in some capacity, and that would engage a larger conversation. So this is at the old mill in Glovertown. Norwegian company in the 20s decided they wanted to build a mill, timber mill, but then went bankrupt. So it never opened. So now it's kind of this relic that is now fenced off, but was used for kind of gathering, a lot of teenagers partying there. But it's kind of this amazing space. From there, took it to Eastern Edge in St. John's, and that was really exciting. We'll get into kind of the particulars of printing a boat that's not flat and all those kind of things. But one of the things that's interesting is you often end up with these impressions that don't actually look very much like a boat, but maybe look more like a splayed fish or something like that. Then took the prints to Port Union, which is on the Bonavista Peninsula, and installed the prints on the factory building, which is the old Union factory in Port Union, and Union House Arts. That's us on the top. And then the final location was in the park itself, in Terra Nova, along the coastal trail, where actually the son of Alfred Squire, the boat builder, lived and farmed potatoes. So that was kind of a nice tie-in. And then I took some little impressions of the transom as kind of gifts for some of the people, for the Alfred Squire family and George or David Saunders and different folks that were, the project definitely couldn't have happened without them. I imagine that's about my 10 minutes, but I think it was a deeply meaningful experience, and I'm very excited to be in next summer in 2024. I'm returning to Eastern Edge to kind of figure out a way of kind of re-engaging these impressions in some sort of kind of installation. And so I'm very excited for the conversation to hear what Charley was up to as well. But the last thing I'll say was that, working with something like Jerome was saying, there's mistakes that get made. I would say that printmaking is maybe the mistakes aren't quite as dire as the mistakes made building a boat. But it was really remarkable to get to meet a lot of old boat builders that were still doing this work, to hear about the ways in which the older techniques of building the ribs out of the crooked roots of trees and things like that, and times of year when you would harvest, and it was very moving to hear like such an intimate knowledge of place, and to meet people that had been in one place and knew their ancestry for so far back, was quite new to me. I that's not something I get to experience very often. So that was also very moving. I might pass it off to Charley or Shazia.
So I'll actually just quickly introduce Charley, and then Charley will get into your presentation. Charley Young is an interdisciplinary artist and educator originally from Alberta, now based in Nova Scotia, Canada. Charley holds a Master of Fine Arts from the Maine College of Art in Portland, Maine, and a Bachelor of Fine Arts from NSCAD University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where she is regular part-time faculty teaching drawing and printmaking. Young's practice combines site-based and indexical methods of making shared between printmaking, drawing, and sculpture. So Charley, with that in mind, please.
Awesome. I'm just going to screen share here. Is that good, Shazia? You can see that?
Yep, I can see that perfectly.
Perfect. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much, St. Michael's, for hosting this, but I'm also just so thrilled to be reconnecting with all of you, Shazia, Jerome, Sylvan. It's, been quite a treat, honestly, to engage with you all again through this discussion. So, as Shazia just kind of spoke about, my name is Charley Young, and I am an interdisciplinary artist. I am regular part-time faculty at NASCAD University, where I teach drawing and printmaking. I'm originally from Calgary, Alberta, which is a landlocked province far away from oceans, but I have actually spent a reasonable amount of time on boats over the years, both on the West Coast and the East Coast, where I live in Halifax, as well as up in the Arctic. So I feel like they've always kind of been an interest for me, but there's always so much more that I'm always trying to learn about boats. So my attraction to printmaking lies in the use of textures and the adoption of found objects, which serve as my matrices. I prescribe to the idea that matrices are really everywhere and that the world is very much a printable surface. My print practice often thrives in settings that are beyond the printmaking studio, and I often work in situ, so sort of embedding myself in a place for a short period of time. And I really identify with, what you were saying earlier, Jerome, in terms of having this sort of deep love for where you are from. And I'm recalling a quote by Lucy Lepard, who speaks about how place for her is the locus of desire, this thing that you're always kind of after. And I very much identify with that. So last May, I was super fortunate to be the visiting artist at St. Michael's Print Shop. And for this discussion today, I'm going to share with you a project which is currently untitled, but I created during that time. And this was a project that I developed with the Wooden Boat Museum of Newfoundland and Labrador in Winterton, Newfoundland. And the museum celebrates a really rich history of wooden boat building, both from a historical perspective, but also from a contemporary perspective, where traditions of boat building continue today, thanks to folks like Jerome. So if you've never been, the Wooden Boat Museum is about an hour and a half drive away from St. John's, and it is so worth the adventure. It's a really special and I think very important place. So before I jump in, I have to acknowledge an amazing team of people from the Wooden Boat Museum who welcomed us to the museum for a few short days to pull some prints from their collection. Betty Earl Barnes, who is the manager at the Wooden Boat Museum, and Jim Dempsey, chair of the Wooden Boat Museum Board of Directors, were both very pivotal in helping to facilitate this project. We also worked alongside a young woman named Ella Reed, who was so delightful and incredibly knowledgeable as our museum interpreter. Fortunate to work alongside master boat builder Jerome Canning, of course, who welcomed us into his boat shed and granted me access to an amazing collection of boat building molds, which served as my matrices for this project. And Jerome was very generous in sharing so much of his extensive knowledge about boat building, and really kind of kept Shazia and I laughing as we worked. We just really enjoyed your company. So finally, I would like to acknowledge my dear friend and fellow printmaker, Shazia, who's our facilitator today, who was my print assistant for this project and super instrumental in the creation of this work. And I really cherished sharing that experience with you. So part of what I love about printmaking, and I think this is, a theme that I've observed in boat building as well, is the relationships that are built in printmaking. That happens for us often in a studio. But I feel very lucky to have shared this experience with so many wonderful people. And I think those relationships are truly an important part of this work. So I should note that I'm not sure, I can't say definitively if this work is entirely finished. The prints have been pulled, but I have not had the opportunity to exhibit this work and sort of think through installation options. So much of what I'm sharing with you today is kind of in progress documentation. So for this project, I developed a small series of large-scale monotypes from the museum's collection of punts and boat building templates known as molds, which are often used in the construction of wooden boats. I use the technique of frottage, which I think of as more of a hybrid process between printmaking and drawing. And for those of you that are maybe not familiar with that term, frottage comes from the French term, which means to rub. And the process is really an automatic kind of immediate process of taking a rubbing from a textural surface. So to pull a print or to pull an impression. Many of you have probably done this. Often it's, a rubbing of a coin or a rubbing of a leaf, that sort of thing. My process is slightly different than that. But you can identify with the fact that it's a fairly simple process, which I think is actually really important when you are working in more of a site-specific way. So my particular process, I begin with what I like to think of as a little bit of a survey, where I'm looking for objects with a very distinctive or identifiable shape or texture. I'm always looking for things that have a very low relief. And I try to see with my fingertips. So often that involves touching and kind of running my finger over the surface of an object, because I feel like I can understand a little bit more about the object through touch than I might be able to perceive visually. So I start in a very kind of tactile way. I then will drape the object that I'm using. In this case, I'm using a transom or a counter, which is at the back or the aft end of the boat. And you can see that I have laid paper directly over the surface there. And I'm using a Japanese paper or a washi paper. Then using a very small brayer, I'm applying a very controlled amount of ink onto the surface of the washi paper. And you can see that in the image on the left-hand side. And one of the important kind of features about frottage is that there is no ink that is actually transferred to the object. So there's a trace amount of ink that lives on the surface of the paper, but there's no ink that transfers to the boat, which of course is very important when you're working with a museum collection. So it's a bit of a difference, I guess, between Sylvan's approach and mine. This print documents at a 1-to-1 scale the shape and the texture of the counter, and it's always kind of very interesting to me to see what is actually revealed through the printing process. There's often a little bit of magic there, where the object is sort of like talking back to you, or the boat is sort of speaking through your mark in a way. You can see that this process requires a certain amount of closeness and directness. So there's this element of like physical proximity and contact. Here, the matrix that I'm using is a 4-oar gunning punt, which was built by Samuel Andrews. This boat would have originally been powered by oars and sails, and was used to hunt seabirds and seals. It's got a very distinctive shape on the top left-hand corner there that you can see. And I learned that this is called the culling or scoring hole, through which you could put an oar, which would then allow you to kind of position and steer the boat. Over time, as you can kind of see in the print on the right-hand side, an outboard motor would have been added, and that's visible there, kind of in the center of the counter. Pretty quickly, Shazia and I moved into the boat shed. Jerome was, very welcoming and letting us kind of raid his boat building molds, and that really kind of turned into more of my focus, I would say, in this project. You can see some photographs of the boat building shed at the Wooden Boat Museum, full of really interesting shapes and textures. And I would challenge like any printmaker to not see this as a room full of found matrices or found objects. Here I'm working with Shazia. You can see my portable little printmaking kit set up there. I use like a little Rubbermaid container. It's very small and easy to transport, and very simple materials that you would find in St. Michael's print shop and other print shops. I always use speedball braid because they're very soft, and I really like kind of the mark that they offer. It's really you can get a lot of detail from them. Here I'm working on washi paper. I used for this project 2 different kinds of paper. One is a Gampi paper, which some of you probably know a little bit about. It can be a very thin, almost invisible paper, or a kozuke paper, which is a little bit thicker and a bit more opaque. That material selection for me was very specific in that I wanted to sort of link to gyutaku, which is a traditional method of fish printing, which was widely practiced in China and Japan prior to the Second World War. And this was a form of printing that was used by fishermen to document their catches. So this print would have been pulled directly from the surface of the fish, and is used to preserve a very accurate record of the fish. So detailing the size of the fish, detailing the species. And this was often, it had to be done on a very thin paper. It had to be thin, which is important for my process as well. So moving along here, I'll show you some of the resulting prints here. So this depicts the shape of 2 counters from boats in the collection of the Wooden Boat Museum. You can see there's 2 prints that are layered over top, or one is layered over top of the other. This is the Gampi paper, which is that very transparent material. And you can see kind of a trace or an echo of one print through the other. The counter in the background is from the Marcus French Rodney, which Jerome built in 2020. And on top of that is the 4-oar gunning punt built by Samuel Andrews nearly 100 years before that. So you saw that image in an earlier slide, kind of the process. Boats undergo various transformations in their design and construction to arrive at different iterations or different generations of boat. And I liked the idea here that every boat is kind of based on one that came before it. In this print, I was really interested in letting that legacy or that ancestry sort of come through and be visible in the work. So really thinking about, the passing down of knowledge in the form of boat building techniques. This image is layered frottage prints that are full-size 3-piece molds. These molds are kind of used as like a little bit of a skeleton to give the boat form in the construction process. And again, this links to the print that you just saw, or one of the counters that you just saw. This is the Marcus French Rodney. Visible here in this print, you can see the forehook, the midship bend, and then also the aft hook. I'm just going to show you a quick little detail here of that piece so you can kind of understand the mark and the texture. They almost kind of read as like little x-rays. The final frottage print that I will share with you, this is from a 2-piece template of a full-sized 13-inch dory bottom that is used in the boat building process. This composition was actually pulled directly from the walls of the boat shed at the Wooden Boat Museum, where these templates, these molds sort of hang layered and repetitive on the wall. You saw that in an earlier image. So together I was really, thinking about these shapes as being reflective of Gothic glass windows, or perhaps, you know, an alternative reading would be receding gravestones, kind of making reference to the idea of dories being used as lifeboats in coastal Newfoundland. So the scale of this work, again, just to kind of remind you of that, is 1-to-1 of the boat building templates. So the print that's kind of on the bottom right-hand side here, the larger of the two, that one is about 36 inches by 8 feet in length. So they're fairly large scale. You can see here that I'm actually positioned on a ladder, looking down on the prints, trying to kind of capture documentation there. And interestingly enough, as we're talking about like legacy and ancestry, there's one of Sylvan's prints actually on the floor at St. Michael's print shop. So I'm going to just quickly wrap up this portion of my introduction. But, you know, really out of that experience, I felt like I had a lot to process after visiting the Wooden Boat Museum. So I developed a small series of soft ground etchings, and they very much reiterate the imagery that you saw in the earlier frottage prints, but they feel very important to me as material studies. So as somebody who's worked with print in a less conventional way for so much of my career, it actually feels very exciting to kind of reflect on print more traditionally, while also kind of reflecting on some of the commonalities I felt were shared between printmaking and boat building, which I think we'll get into in our discussion here. So image on the left-hand side, these are the two counters that, again, you saw in earlier frottage prints. This uses plywood as a soft ground texture, and plywood is a material that has kind of been more newly adopted by boat builders. So I wanted to sort of draw like a material link to the boat shed. The image on the right-hand side, again, you can see that dory bottom template being used again as a composition. And here I'm actually came up with a little bit of my own invented process for this work, where the larger of the two shapes in the center print, the one that's very textural, was actually created using latex rubber. So I used a sculpture material, pulled an impression from the floor of St. Michael's print shop, which was the former home of United Sail Works, and use this latex impression as the texture of the soft ground. So indirectly sort of transferring the surface of the floor of St. Michael's print shop kind of onto the copper plate. So thinking a little bit about you know, the portability of place. So the image on the right-hand side, again, is kind of a familiar diagram here of a three-piece mold. But again, I was thinking about texture, and I was thinking about the inherent symmetry and mirroring and repetition that I think we see, you know, shared between the disciplines of printmaking and boat building. So I'm going to wrap it up and leave it there, because I know we have so much to talk about, and I'm sure I'm over my 10 minutes, but I'll pass that back to you, Shazia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie. It was an extremely special experience, I have to say, one that was unforgettable. And again, thank you, Jerome. So with that in mind, we'll get the discussion going. You actually answered the first thing I was going to talk about, which was the choice of wooden boats. So we'll move on to something and we'll come back to it. So the concept of matrix or template is one that's common to both boat building and to printmaking. Now, were you aware that there would be similarities between boat building and printmaking before you started your projects, Charley and Sylvan? And if not, if so, how did you reconcile those similarities? I'll let either of you go first, and then we'll come to Jerome too.
I feel like maybe Charley would actually have more to say on this, because it seems like that was informing a little bit more of the process. I would say that wasn't so. I wasn't so much like, I mean, I am a printmaker, and that is the kind of technical discipline that I often am using to engage with these materials, but I wasn't so much trying to kind of engage with the history of printmaking. In some ways, I was trying to kind of like blow it open a little bit, or like kind of really reconsider what is possible. And in some ways, it's almost a lot more painterly what I'm doing in a sense, even though it is a relief printing process. That being said, and multiples were not made. So that being said, the use of these forms that Charley was really engaging with, that allow for boats to both be kind of recreated, but then also to adapt, I increasingly became curious about, and it was really remarkable to actually get to handle forms that had been passed down, hundreds of years, perhaps. They originate in Ireland or in England, and they're still in people's living rooms. So that was really remarkable, and I was definitely not inking those up. And so there is that. Yeah, it's not totally an answer to your question, but like a real fascination with that passing down. And one of the things I've actually been interested about and kind of early days in is exploring like how, while I was on the East Coast of Newfoundland, I learned that, depending on the bay that you're in, someone might have a different definition of what a punt is. And then considering like, what are the wooden boat techniques for a punt on the East Coast, and how would that be similar or different on the West Coast of Canada, and what how similar or different would those forms be? So that's kind of still a question I'm kind of holding and hoping to engage with further. But I would love to hear, Charley, because you kind of engaged a little bit more with the actual forms themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, yeah, to kind of answer that question, I mean, I always try to go into a project fairly like informed. I try to do, especially where it's like, the way that I work can be, you're spending a short amount of time in one place. I try to really do a certain amount of research in advance. And I felt super lucky, actually. I was staying with Pam Hall, and Pam's book, The Encyclopedia of Local Knowledge, has so much amazing information in there about, the very interesting kind of specifics of boat building. So I really kind of started a lot of my research there. Of course, go to the rooms and check out, the exhibitions there. But, I think the other main source for me was Jerome and everybody at the Wooden Boat Museum, who really started to highlight a lot of these like commonalities that I was seeing between printmaking and boat building, which I don't know how much I knew about that, before this project, but it was really kind of through the making of the project that I started to think about the matrix as being, an important, the language might be different, but the idea is the same. We're creating multiples in printmaking, and in boat building, that's kind of the purpose of the molds, is to be able to have some kind of standardized form to return to create multiples or reproduce, right? So, thinking about the matrix and multiplicity, thinking about different iterations that are possible, those are things that I think we see in boat building and printmaking. Yeah, so I don't know, I think it's really ripe for me. Like, it feels like it's, they kind of go hand in hand in a way, like there's a lot of commonality. So I guess the other thing I'll say on that note is the idea of the matrix, again, it's like used to reproduce something. The matrix, I kind of recently recognized that it comes from the term matriarch, which means womb or making of life. And, you know, I think the shape of some of the counters from some of the boats are really kind of in reference to like the reproduction system of women as, you know, vessels ourselves. And as people who give life to a future generation, right? And I think there's like a really beautiful parallel there in terms of wooden boats also, you know, like they are a very significant form of transportation and survival in coastal Newfoundland, and you know, being able to provide fish and collect supplies and travel between communities is super important as a means of survival. So, you know, I think there's just like, there's a lot of like really rich overlap to kind of summarize all of that.
Can I just add, like, as you were talking, there's also something about utility, I think, that's interesting in both printmaking and I think wooden boat building, in that, you know, both of these ways of building or making were once really tied to a utility and still are. But as our technology changes, there's, you know, a lithograph, we're no longer printing scores of music. I mean, in some ways we still use lithographic processes to print. But like, you know, etchings, those types of prints were initially made to like reproduce books and things like that, and still do, but then are adapted into more of a fine arts context or a creative context. And in some ways there's a similar thing occurring with boat building, or at least wooden boat building, in that like as the technology changes and you can build an aluminum boat that's not going to, you know, have the same kind of wear that a wooden boat is going to have, the purpose or the role that a wooden boat serves shifts a little bit. And so, yeah, that is maybe also a shared link between the two disciplines.
Actually, that's an excellent segue into a question. Jerome, I'm going to bring you into this one too. So we've talked about the wooden boat as matrix now, and Sylvan just brought up obviously technological changes and advances which affect everything in life and every discipline. Now, how have you noticed that specifically how have you noticed that unfolding with wooden boat building?
Well, I don't know if you can bring it up, Charlie, but there's a drawing of one superimposed counter over the counter of Samuel Andrews over the counter of Marcus French, this one here, yes. These are actually two punts. Both of them are considered Rodneys. Okay, so the smaller one, the darker one, that's Sammy, Uncle Sammy, he's called down here, an endearment. That's he's a gunning punt, 4-oar gunning punt. It's very old, as Charlie pointed out. It's over 100 years old. The one you know is imposed on is one by Marcus French. Is a one that we use in teaching our wooden boat. You know, our workshops. That's the one we build in our workshops. I found it quite interesting. The reason I went. One of the many reasons I ended up in Winterton is because of this. I was driving with my wife, Kathy, who does printmaking, by the way. She and I were driving past this museum, and this boat was on the side of the road, ready to go into the museum, you know, to be taken care of and put on display. And when I saw this boat, I stopped the car and pulled in, and I recognize the brilliance of the builder in this boat. It's a gunning punt is actually what we call in Newfoundland a cranky boat. By that, it's a boat that is, for its length, is narrow. And the reason for its length to width ratio, in this particular case of Uncle Sammy's gunning punt, she's 16 foot. I forget the width right now, but it's about a ratio of length to width. 3.3, 3.4. This is an important sort of concept when you're looking at a gunning punt, compared with the boat of Marcus French, which is really and truly a Rodney too, but is more of a fishing boat, which is used every day. The gunning punt was used only when food was needed in the fall of the year for birds, in the early spring and late spring for seals. And so when I look at this boat here with Uncle Sammy's, I realize that the proportions are perfect. You capture it really well, Charlie. It's she's delicate. Uncle Sammy's boat is built light. It's you can see the very lovely shape in the counter, where it actually looks like a wine glass stern. Some people refer to it, whereas the other one's a bit heftier. But two different purposes. But what I like about it is that you captured that, and that to me says one boat has this purpose. It's a hunting boat. You have two people who are rowing and a person with a muzzleloader in the bow of that boat. And that food that you get at that time, 100 years ago, was important food. So the boat builder took care to make it to a point that she can row fast, chase the bird or the seal, and yet at the same time, not ensure, to protect the safety of those that are seeking that food. And the boat behind, the Marcus French, that's another type, is one that hauled trawls. It was not used for going after birds, that's for sure, because you can see by the heftiness of it, Uncle Sammy's is fast. The other is quite a good rowing boat. It's an excellent rowing boat, but you can see that it doesn't have the delicacy of that. I really liked it because it became very important to me. The first time I seen that, by the way, was today. And when I looked at it, was, as I said earlier before, we're all online here, I said to Charlie and Shazia, I was moved by it because it's two men, Marcus French. By the way, Marcus French shape and all that are really the Andrews people, Samuel Andrews, that was Ella's great granddaughter, by the way, great grandfather, excuse me, Mr. Reed, that comes into this latest thing for me. He was influenced, Mr. Reed, her great grandfather, by that man who built that boat and shaped that boat. That young woman who was 17 years old last year, or 18, maybe, I can't remember, I don't know her age, but a young lady. Her grandfather, or great grandfather, pardon me, was influenced by the man who built this boat here. And he was him and his brother, Basford, were known boat builders. And and a whole winter I've been listening to DAI archival interviews with the John Andrews. This is, again, Ella, who we've mentioned, talking about this guy. And it's just remarkable to see this delicate boat by the way, superimposed over another delicate boat. One was just one purpose only, is to get, this boat was used in Newfoundland. There's a saying here, the hungry month of March. This boat was used in that hungry month of March. The hungry month of March was when people went out, pulled out in a bay full of ice, when their vegetables in the cellars and that were running low, and they needed food. And so this punt was hauled out, pushed on the beach, oars were put aboard, and they moved with a gun to kill the seal for food. Okay, not for pelts and everything, for food for their family, because food stocks were running low at that time of the year. So when you're looking at this superimposed, beautiful counter, you're looking at a person who, in shaping that, was thinking of his family and, his family's welfare in terms of their health and their survival. And that's also true of the boat underneath it. When I collect lines, your method is beautiful, by the way. I do it in this geometric way of, it's a grid system I set up. But my God, when I take a look at that, I think I'll use your technique for the smaller boats. It just grabs it so well. Although it may take me too long. I have limitations to my time, but you did it fast. I remember that last year. You were very, very fast. But anyway, you captured one-to-one, as you point out. Beautiful shape. Anyway, I liked it. And it was moving to me because what you see there is the lives of people who are getting to know through storytelling here in this community. Marcus French, I'm getting to know because his son is still alive in this community. And this man, Andrews, whose great-grandchildren are still alive. And it's sort of like, it's not, how would I put it? It's not like it's just a piece of wood or a counter. It's the story of a time and the people who shaped these boats. I was really pleased to see this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerome. That was lovely. And actually, we segued into something else that I'd noted down, and you did it beautifully. So the idea of transferring knowledge, obviously, it's passing it down from generations, is one that exists across everything. It exists in printmaking and in wooden boat building. So how is the skill of wooden boat building being taught now? And then once we're done with Jerome, then we'll move on to Charley and Sylvan to discuss what they learned about that through their processes too. But we'll start with you, Jerome.
How is it done now? Well, first, the people who are interested in learning how to build boat are very educated people, not that well trained in mental templates. The older builders they didn't have drawings. They had those molds that was, you took the shape of the midship bin, they took forehook. They had some of these molds, they had other systems, but for the most part, the boat was actually a collection of images that they held and were given to from experience, because they just didn't build a boat, they used the boat, they lived the boat. The boat was in their community, on the beaches, in the sheds, they were under stages, on top of wharves. These boats, they rowed them, they sailed them, they lived in the story of boats, and they had mental, mind images of these boats. So when they learned, this is where they grabbed their shapes. They would go into woods to find a stem, for instance, and the stem had to be a certain shape so that if there's a wave in the stern, lifts the boat and pushes that boat forward, you didn't want it to capsize and dig in and fill with water. So they knew the stem that would balance the boat from stern to bow. But the image they had was in their head. They didn't take a template into the woods. They took the image was there. They knew when they looked at a tree, when they saw in that tree the stem, they knew it. It was, as you superimpose that image of Uncle Sammy's boat over Marcus French's boat, they would have this mental image and they would superimpose that in their mind over the shape of that trunk of a tree. Then they said, that's my stem, because that's my mental image of the stem I want. Today, most people don't have that development. They don't have that capacity that what we're talking about. Really, they need another object, a template, to bring it into the woods and to superimpose that over the tree. They need a drawing. No matter how much most of the participants look at a drawing, that old time training that was in every child, man, woman, all of them, they all had this memories. One of the things that's shocking, actually, is the memories they have. They recall little details that are just blow you away. How did I miss that? But they don't miss a thing. And it's really great to be in the company of the older generation who sadly are passed on. They didn't miss a thing. They knew dimension without numbers. They knew harmony without, master's thesis or something. They just knew they knew how a boat's proportions should be. It just built into them, because that's what they lived. They lived that life. It's changed. I teach them now through mathematics, geometry, replicating shapes through, I have tons of templates as you use, of course. And it would take a long time for a person to actually come to that point where the generations before us where they lift us is to have that mental image. It takes a lot of training to see it. It's not in, well, first of all, boat building is in danger, you know, wooden boat building. So it's going to be hard to train. You have to live. I'm afraid that's what you have to do. You have to live. A boat builder isn't just a person who builds boats. He has to be underwater in that boat that he's built. So you have to live it, and you have to see how that physical shape fits the water, how it moves in the water. And then that will send him back into the woods in the fall to change it if it doesn't fit well.
So Charley and Sylvan, did you want to add something to what Jerome just said?
Sorry, do you want to go ahead, Sylvan?
Sure. I just wanted to add that I think what Jerome, I mean, I love that notion of a boat that fits the water, and I think I was often reminded of the kind of saying that the old boat builders could see the boats in the trees. And I guess I'm struck by there's an intuitive understanding that I think has to be lived, and you know, we can learn how to build boats, but to be able to do it in that way, I think I guess I'm reminded of hearing stories during my stay of just the extent to which, you know, in the way that I grew up playing with a bike. You know, if you grew up on the off Newfoundland on the islands before relocation, you were playing on punts like I grew up on bikes, and you know, that's starting at such a young age, you know, you being kind of 12 and playing around with building a boat, you know, like that. And it maybe in a sense that beginning with a sense of play does kind of imbue, you know, a life that is, there's just a sense that it wasn't a big deal to build a boat, you know, in many ways, a boat was being built every year, and if not more than one. So, I guess it's an interesting thing, you know, as I guess I'm curious or interested about as things change, that how that intuitive understanding gets lost or maybe just replaced with different intuitive understandings. But that kind of material understanding of like how wood is going to flow, or how water is going to flow past a certain shape of a hull, is just, it seems like magic now that someone could just do that without doing all the calculations. But just it was very inspiring.
They calculated. Don't think for 1 second that they didn't calculate. They just didn't use the mathematical numbers that we are so comfortable with. We have a go-between shape and understand right now, and it's just called mathematics and geometry, where they had a experience of shape. The boat itself was an experience. When they saw a hull, it wasn't like, as I pointed out earlier, a ratio to them. They just had this experience that she's too fat, she's too narrow, she's too high, she's too low. They just had this, and where this experience is a mathematical concept, this experience. One of the things I see in printmaking that is different than boats is the third dimension of shape. When I look at your prints, they are a two-dimensional representation of parts, and they're gorgeous, really. But the boat that I'm familiar with, and all boats and all objects, are really just multiple shapes, and there's multiple of connections between the shapes. I described to you a stem. The stem has to be balanced against a counter. The way that flowed and fit into water all along that shape, which is what you showed in your midship bend, abthook, and forehook. These are important concepts to not just the builder, but to all the users, because not every person who used the boat was actually a good boat builder, by the way. Some didn't build boats, you know, but they were around those boats. Not everybody who had a boat built a boat, and not every community had a pile of boat builders. That's some people. But one of the things that and really the sole ones that I'm interested in is the fishermen or fisher persons, as we say today. It's all, and the builder. I like the person who lives the life. They create the boat that they use. That's my interest in punts, and in that using, I'm really interested in community and how it all was passed down to them and how it moved forward. I hope this added to your understanding. I love the prints, but they're just gorgeous. I'm going to go on and on about that.
I think it's interesting too, though. I mean, like, I totally hear what you're saying. And I feel like as an interdisciplinary artist, I'm often confronted by the flatness of printmaking. And I think maybe, Sylvan, that's like, you know, there's some exciting possibilities in your work in terms of like printing on textiles. Like there's just from the documentation and things like that that you showed, there's like a movement and almost like a life that is literally being kind of breathed into the work. But I think like in printmaking too, it's like there's you know, we often speak about community and we speak about this like transfer of knowledge, and that happens it happens in multiple ways, but I think often it happens in a studio over a printing press when you're jamming through a project and you're, you know, having issues and you're trying to problem solve things. And, you know, there's this generosity I sort of observe in a print studio that I think is like, you know, very much a part of boat building too, in terms of just, you know, sharing maybe what has worked, what does not work, like tips, tricks, suggestions. Like there's, you know, maybe it kind of stems from being two disciplines that are a little bit more technical, or they have to be a little bit more technical. Like there's like consequences otherwise. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's just like an interesting thing. And I mean, historically, like printmaking, of course, has been a very significant discipline in terms of being a repository of knowledge. It's like the output of knowledge in being able to kind of depict it, to represent it, but to put it out into the world in the form of multiples. So I think it's like, you know, for me, that's part of the reason I love printmaking, is because I think the history is just like incredibly rich. And I always feel like I'm just at the tip of hey, here's a Newfoundland thing for you, like the tip of the iceberg there, like in terms of the history of print. But I think that like that history of the discipline is always something that I'm looking to kind of pull out of the work. So yeah, you know, printmaking, just again, making like huge, significant contributions to recorded knowledge. So yeah.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Jerome. Thank you, Sylvan. Sylvan, just very quickly, this will be the last point that I bring up, and then Jerome, you may feel free also to add something to this just from your own experience. Sylvan, I know that you are also doing some work with boat building in BC. At the moment, you said you were looking at boats in BC. Are you doing some more work around that out of curiosity, or did I get that wrong?
Yeah, I would say pretty early days, but around the same time, not so much boat building, but did a project that engaged with a historic boat on the west coast in Vancouver called the St. Rock, which is housed in the Vancouver Maritime Museum, and did a technique that was kind of closer to what Charlie was doing. You know, that was working in a museum context, was not going to apply ink to the boat itself, and that's a boat with a kind of a remarkable history, very complicated colonial history. It was an RCMP boat in the Inuit for managing Inuit communities in the Arctic, but was the first boat to circumnavigate North America and complete the Northwest Passage. I actually can hold on. I'll quickly, just because I think it's interesting how it ties in with Charlie's work. But invited the community to come on board the boat, and we just go down to it. and we did different frottage rubbings. So very similar, this time not with ink, but with graphite. And then I took those, scanned them, and then set them to silk screens. And then we printed them in different places throughout the neighborhood and at the museum. And the result was these kind of fractured textures of the boat itself. It was the anniversary of the 80th anniversary of its passage, of the Northwest Passage, last year. And so to kind of engage with that history, to maybe reconsider it, to take an opportunity to, like, now kind of consider what a remarkable achievement it did. It spent 2 years kind of stuck in the ice on its way to complete that initial passage. And then now we have a different understanding. We also have maybe a fuller understanding of what was going on in other parts of its roles up north. So the square and the circle, that's they're kind of drawn from the nautical sign for distress, which is generally a black square and circle on an orange background. But in this sense, it's kind of the flotsam of the print. So I would say this is maybe the most kind of like realized kind of interest in boat building on the West Coast. But definitely, definitely interested in looking at actually more the kind of difference in technique used specifically with the smaller boats and the smaller wooden boats. But this is, I mean, a much larger schooner that was a wooden boat. So.
Okay, well, excellent. Thank you very much. We are coming up to 7:20 here in Newfoundland, but we do have questions from our attendees. And also, I would encourage more people to type questions in the chat if you would like to for our panelists. So Charley, the first question is for you. It is, Charley, what kind of ink did you use to get the frottage prints? They're amazing.
Oh my goodness, thanks. You know what? I just use an oil-based ink. So it's honestly, you have it in the shelf at St. Michael's print shop. I use an oil-based ink, and I sometimes add a little bit of a dryer to them because otherwise, as printmakers know, it can take a long time for ink to dry. And when I'm working site specifically, I just don't really have that time always. It still takes a little time, but yeah, it's just oil-based ink, just a very skinny amount of ink. So yeah. Thank you for that question.
And Sylvan, the second question is for you, actually. A technical question for Sylvan. Did you remove the ink from the boat after printing? And if so, how?
The ink was not removed from the boat after printing. And I think I'm not sure that would be possible, or would take a lot of pretty unpleasant chemicals, I think, to remove the ink. In this case, the boat worked closely with the Squire Penny family, and they were, the boat was rotting in the field and didn't have many years left. So they were just excited to see someone engage with it in the kind of last stage of its life. That being said, I am really interested in like the left trace on the boat or surfaces, and how that can kind of function alongside the print. So if you were to visit that farm now, you would see this old punt that now has these colored ribs, or this colored hull, and that kind of excites me. That obviously in the right context, that can be an exciting way of kind of creating a story and creating a sense of kind of community engagement. But if you want to not get ink on a hull, Charley's approach is much more appropriate.
Different strokes for different folks, right? Like different techniques come in handy for different reasons. Yeah.
And I would say it's actually, the technique is kind of opposite to, like, you know, I'm applying things that will make the ink stay open longer. So not putting the opposite of dryers in, putting things like clove oil is the best thing I've found to make sure that ink doesn't dry up. So, you know, a punt that's 15, 16 feet, that can take hours to ink up, and then hours to rub. So that can take a full day to make one print. So you can't have the ink drying, and even certain colors will dry, like ultramarine blue, you know, really tough to work with. It will dry up on you. Whereas green, phthalo green will, you know, that will never dry up on you. So yeah, different, and applying quite a bit of ink in order to be able to kind of rub and get that impression. So yeah, thanks for the question.
All right, and there's actually another question for both of you. I was wondering what the next step with such a fascinating and historically needed project. What is the possible next step with all of this?
Do you have an answer?
I mean, I guess I will be back in Newfoundland in 2024, and doing a residency at Eastern Edge Gallery. I think mainly like figuring out how different ways of presenting the prints, and kind of activating them. So don't know if I have a specific answer, but there's kind of something in the works, and it won't be so dissimilar from likely what I've shown today.
Cool. I'm excited that you're returning. That'll be, I mean, that's always like such a special opportunity, I think. But yeah, you know, I'm not sure I have a super good answer to that either. I'm very slow as an artist. It takes me a long time to like process and digest things, and I'm actually trying to work even slower these days, which can sometimes be hard. But yeah, I'm to be honest, I'm not quite sure. I mean, it's been interesting to put together this presentation today and kind of think about this work some more, because, you know, I think like every artist, we can always identify with things that we love about the work, but maybe things that we would do differently or try differently again. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've done a lot of work. I've done a lot of frottage work. Some of my past work has been really ambitious. I've done 4-story historic properties in downtown Halifax. I did a rubbing from a gold rush era building in Dawson City in the Yukon 10 plus years ago now. But you know, I feel like I've kind of stretched the medium pretty widely there. But my interests right now are really in thinking about how to bring sculpture and printmaking a little bit closer together. Like Jerome was talking about, you know, maybe one of the drawbacks of print, or maybe one of the challenges I feel like I'm constantly confronted with is the flatness, the two-dimensionality. Feels like it doesn't always speak entirely how I need it to speak. And that's where I think yeah, working more sculpturally for me seems really interesting. It just in the studio, I'm always working on different things, but I've been working with latex rubber and alginate and materials like that. So I don't have a good answer for you, but things are always simmering, and there's, you know, always kind of stuff on the back burner. But yeah, trying to find like the relationship between print and sculpture through investigations with place will persist. I'm not, yeah, I'll leave it there because I don't have an answer more than that, but thank you. That's a really good question.
Charley, have you, while I was in around Glovertown, I met a couple people that were actually taking silicone molds of old wooden boats to create boats with different materials. So there's another tie-in with boat building and more kind of sculptural mold making techniques.
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool, Sylvan. I'll have to pick your brain about that.
Okay, and Jerome, what's next for you? Just briefly.
I'm going to cook supper. For me, my son and I are actually working on a project called the John Reed Project. history of the punt and the evolution of the punt. And we're looking at a graphic comic presentation of it. So that's going to take a long time. I'm doing a lot of drawings myself. And he just said, my drawings are very stick oriented. But there's that's in the making for us. We're looking at the changing shape of the bay punt to become the trap skiff. And so I thought, but the important thing for me is the people. They have to be part of talking about the boat. So this is what we're looking at. He's very talented, drawing, writing, this kind of stuff. And so I'm leaning on him to help me through with this.
That's fantastic. And again, speaking of, passing knowledge down from generations. Well, we don't seem to have any more questions in the Q&A. So I will thank all three of you for being here. Thank you so much for participating, for agreeing to be part of this, and just for this incredible panel. This has been so, so special.
Thank you. Thanks, Shazia. Well done.
Oh, well done to all of you. I'll wish you all a good evening. And again, thank you so, so much for being part of this.
Thank you very much, everybody. All the best to each and every one.
Take care. Oh, they're clapping. Okay. I was like, somebody's clapping. I guess I should too. Thank you again. Have a good night.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you
Bye. All the best
for this.